24 frames per second is the golden standard of frame rate for video. And to be honest, I don't really like it. I'm one of those psychopaths that likes watching even talking head videos at 60 frames per second. I think this looks better than this when it comes to talking head videos. Anyway, if you've been following my channel, you'll know that I've been shooting in 4K 60, which I think looks cool, but I've been running into all kinds of overheating issues since I don't have super duper camera gear that can handle it. And when you're a content creator limited by time, the last thing you need is to be sitting around waiting for your camera to cool down. What a pain in the butt. So right away, shooting at a lower frame rate is much easier on your camera. Okay, so 24 frames per second has been the golden standard in video since like the 1920s, as it offers realistic motion blur, which is great for storytelling, and it has the most cinematic look. I get it. Without motion blur, things look extra smooth, like a video game. Some love it, others don't. Generally, I think it's safe to say that 24 frames per second is the standard for movies, 30 frames per second is the standard for TV and sports, since smoother playback is nice for action, then 60 frames per second is used for slow motion and not necessarily to be used as a standalone timeline, which is what I like to do. But then, as we all know with video games, the higher the frame rate, the better. Unless there are any of you that like playing video games at 24 frames per second. There aren't, are there? Honestly though, I think you can still shoot action just fine in 24. Unless you're swapping the frame rates consistently like I'm doing, you get used to whatever frame rate you're watching. Eventually you don't even notice it. The beauty of all of this is that each frame rate offers a different look, and as you get better with your video skills, you can bounce around between them. There are different tools you can use to help tell your story in the style that you want. It's like art. There's no right or wrong when it comes to art. It's all personal preference. But when you are starting out and you just want to learn how to make nice looking videos like your favorite YouTubers, it can be confusing to know which frame rate to use and why. So today I'm going to talk about why, how, even though I don't really like it, I think 24 frames per second is the best frame rate to use when you're starting out. In my completely amateur, all I do is make YouTube videos opinion, the most important thing most creators don't really understand is the importance of light. Light is color. Light is sharpness. Light is the #1 goal. The reason I say this is I remember early on in my journey, I was trying to color grade footage with my APS-C camera and a kit lens, not understanding why my footage looked like hot garbage. I used 30 frames per second, shot an S-Log, yada yada, just like my favorite creators did. But when I tried to make that footage look nice, ew, what was going on? I even bought lights they said were good lights, but still ugly footage. It was all because I didn't have enough light. Look, when you're recording outside, that's one thing. The sun is like an ocean of light, but when you're indoors, everything changes. If you block out a room, for example, even a cob light is still like a bucket of water compared to the ocean of the sun. It's a teeny bit of light. And I'm saying all that to say this. When you don't have a great camera with a wide open lens, every tiny bit of light you can get into your camera matters. Every 1/3 of a stop of light helps and can be the difference between a clean shot with vibrant colors and a dirty one that looks blocky and gross and noisy. When making a video and trying to get correct exposure, meaning enough light to properly expose your shot, there are 3 things that balance correct exposure. The aperture, or how much light your lens allows to hit the sensor, the shutter speed, which opens and closes. The faster or more it closes, the less light it lets in, and the ISO, which is how sensitive your sensor is to the light. The rule of thumb with video, and I'll be testing this in an upcoming video, is your shutter speed should be double your frame rate. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, then your shutter is 1/50th of a second. If you're shooting at 60 frames per second, your shutter speed will be 1/125th of a second. If everything else is the same as far as aperture and ISO, the difference between those shutter speeds is 1 1/3 stops of light. And if you don't know, a stop of light means doubling the light. So just this tiny difference in shutter speed means you are over doubling the amount of light hitting your sensor. That's huge. Here's what that looks like without editing in post. Here's the difference between shooting at 1/50th of shutter speed compared to 1/125th. That's a massive difference in light right there. If you tried playing around in post with the colors on this footage, I guarantee you the dark image would look like crap compared to the brighter one. But that's essentially the challenge you're giving yourself when you shoot at faster shutter speeds. You have less light and less color to play with. Unless you really know what you're doing, it's very hard to make underexposed footage look good. Now, a lot of modern cameras are so good you can bump up the ISO and still have a pretty clean looking image, even if you don't have enough light. But they aren't magic. Full frame is so much more forgiving than APS-C, and then the smaller your sensor is, the worse it gets in low light. Heck, put your camera in selfie mode in a dark room and see how that looks. My Sony ZV-E1 with its huge full frame sensor and insanely wide open f1.4 G Master lens can make shooting in 1/125th of a second look super clean, because I can raise the ISO and the camera can recover the shadows and the highlights nicely. But maybe your cheaper crop sensor camera with a f4 lens can't. Or your phone can't. Especially not if you try and have a smooth frame rate, making it have to work harder by raising the ISO. My point is this: when you don't have the best gear, best lighting, or shooting conditions, and don't fully understand how all of this stuff works, you're making things more challenging on yourself by adding frames to your footage and reducing the amount of light your camera is getting. For anyone out there who just wants to make YouTube videos and have them look as good as possible, I think that is the easiest to do in the mode where you get the maximum amount of light, and that is 24 frames per second. I wish I knew that starting out, because I was buying the wrong gear and the wrong lights and trying to make my footage look good, and it never did. I chose my frame rate first before I knew what the heck I was doing. I shouldn't have, because my footage always looked like crap. Who cares if it was in 30 frames per second or 60 frames per second? I mean, sometimes it looked good when I'd shoot outside or near a big window, but then it would look like crap in my blacked out studio with my 3 LED lights, or when I shot near a small window. And I never quite understood just how different those environments were with how much light was coming in. I think 24 frames per second is the easiest frame rate to shoot in because it allows in more light than the other frame rates, and that makes the colors look better and is easier to work on. You can shoot for longer periods since the files are smaller, plus it's the easiest frame rate on the camera and is least likely to make your camera overheat. Then, when you understand lighting better and or perhaps get a better camera and lens, you can start working with the other frame rates, and it becomes easier because you'll understand why they look different since they're getting different amounts of light, and you'll know how to compensate for it without ruining the footage. This might seem basic to some of you, but it took me years to fully comprehend this. I started in the other direction, trying to make the smoother frame rates look good, and it was hard because I didn't know what I was doing and I didn't have enough light. I guess this is the hard part about learning things on your own. I think if you focus on maximizing light first, your footage will look good. Outdoors is so easy because any camera can get enough light outdoors, but once you get indoors, things become tricky. I always wanted to have my own studio that was blacked out and I could control all the lighting, but it took me so long to make it look good because I didn't know what I was doing and I had the wrong gear. Just don't make that mistake. You can shoot by a big window or in a room with lots of natural light, but then when you make a lot of micro edits like I do, the clouds and the variable light make the shot so inconsistent, the footage can kind of look amateur. Every couple seconds, the light might change, and it's distracting. That's why I prefer to close the windows when I'm doing this talking head stuff. One thing I want to mention is that I shot this video at 60 frames per second. I then rendered it at 24 frames per second and again at 30 frames per second, then dropped them all on a 60 FPS timeline. Now what that means is when I'm showing you 24 frames per second footage, while it is 24 frames per second footage, since it's missing frames and it won't naturally fit in a 60 frames per second timeline, it will duplicate certain frames. However, I tested 24 FPS on a 24 FPS timeline and 24 FPS on a 60 FPS timeline, and I think while they looked slightly different, it was close enough that most people wouldn't notice the difference. What I'm saying is this video doesn't accurately represent 24 frames per second, but it's so close. And I still wanted to create it this way so I could do side by side of 24 versus 60 frames per second just to showcase just how different they look. All right, hopefully you found value in this video. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I always appreciate the likes, the comments, and the subs, so thank you if you're able to support the channel that way. It's the only way I can grow my channel and make better videos. I will make a video talking more about 30 frames per second and put that here once it's ready. Then I'll create another one on 60 frames per second and I'll link that one here once it's done. If you want to watch some more of me but want me to talk about something else, this is the video of mine YouTube thinks you'll enjoy next. Lastly, if you want to see what each frame rate looks like in their own dedicated timelines, I created a series on that which you can watch here. Appreciate your time, and as always, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on The Sad Studio.